Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we're going to talk about Andrzej Rozycki. So Andrzej is a fighter from Ireland whose style primarily focuses on good forward aggression, fighting in the pocket, thrusts, and hang-in parries. But as always, we're going to start off this style review with the pre-fencing, and that specifically has to do with the footwork that Andrzej uses to set all of that up. In this particular case, Andrzej will generally fight with his right leg forward and use that position in his left plow to throw deep thrusts to his target as an opener. So looking at one of these exchanges, what we can see is that Andrzej, again, will fight with his right leg forward. But something else to look at here is the position of Andrzej's left plow. As you can see, Andrzej's left plow will often point off to the right side of his opponent for the reason of not allowing his point or long point to be engaged with by deflecting cuts. And what that does is it allows him to threaten his opponent in a particular way where his opponent doesn't necessarily know if his first action is going to be a thrust, as is usually what he does, or a defensive action like we're going to see here. So with this particular exchange, what we see is Andrzej not getting his initial thrust off as is normal, but instead coming forward with a hard parry. And the reason that this hard parry works is because of this point off left plow that he started in. As you can see here, he shoves his crossguard up into a plow, basically baiting his opponent into throwing an attack onto one of his sides. At which point, Andrzej normally would attempt to hanging parry on that side in order to stay safe. But in this particular sense, Andrzej made a slight mistake, which is that his opponent, instead of going into his Quran, simply pulled off, gave him no feedback, and cut him in the hands. But looking at this exchange where we see this work out a lot better, what we see is Andrzej's stylistic move and choice to always try to open with a lead thrust. And the reason this works is, again, because of this left plow position. That lead thrust is very quick, very direct, and with the right leg having been forward, it allows him to set himself up for a position where he can throw that thrust with very little tell. Basically, if you're going to thrust somebody and you're going to take a passing step, what can often happen is that people will see your weight shift from your back leg to your front leg or vice versa, and they'll try to time that to predict when your attack is coming. A lead leg lunge, as you're seeing Andrzej do here, has significantly less tells because the only thing you can really see is the lead leg come off of the ground, at which point the forward momentum has already started. But as you'll see often, that lead thrust does not always land, but that is okay because Andrzej's follow-up is to use the information he gains from the hard parry of missing that thrust to go into a hang-in parry and a repost combination. Now, the reason this can work so well is because of the hard bind that you get into whenever you miss, or more specifically, you've been parried out of a thrust. So you see right about here, as his opponent shoves his hands up into the air, Andrzej can feel the fact that his opponent has taken all of the weight and all of the momentum out of that bind. And what you know from that situation is that someone is going to be pulling off and throwing another attack. At which point, given the closeness that the bind was happening at, all Andrzej has to do is basically figure out which side his opponent is going to attack on, whether it be his left side or his right side, and throw the hang-in parry in that zone in order to keep himself safe. So the reason I was talking about earlier with the bind pressure is that when you're in a situation where your hands are touching, it makes it very, very easy to throw hanging parries because there's nothing in the way of your tip. So in this particular case, when Andrzej's opponent threw that left cut, all he had to do was basically chase his opponent's hands with his own hands, and that would naturally lead him into a position where that hang-in parry is going to be right in the path that it needed to be. Also, something worth pointing out is that whenever Andrzej will throw these cuts to the hands after the break, he tends to do it while leaving the exchange. This is indicative of someone who doesn't necessarily want to always grapple, but it's also a very smart thing to do because it helps keep you safe from Zvercopters, specifically in that leaving the exchange gives you the space and the time to hit a target that you want to hit, and then back out so that your opponent doesn't necessarily know how to hit you back. So moving on to the next exchange, we see once again this exact same lead leg lunge, but we see a slightly different parry out of Andrzej's opponent. And specifically, going back to the concept of feeling what your opponent is doing out of the bind, what Andrzej feels in this particular bind is his opponent simply not being there at all. Whereas before, he might have felt an immense amount of pressure, shoving his blade off to the left side or up into the air. Andrzej feels nothing, and what that tells him to do is it tells him to throw a counterattack early rather than waiting for his opponent. And this is a tricky situation to be in whenever you are this kind of in the pocket fencer, because what you have to watch out for are people who will simply delay their attacks. And that's exactly what happens with Andrzej's opponent here. But as you can see, after Andrzej throws his lunge and throws his counterattack, again, seizing on the opportunity given to him by his opponent by basically not doing anything and hovering up in the air, what happens is that Andrzej gets into a sort of dangerous position because his opponent can simply throw an attack at the exact same, but opposite angle of Andrzej and probably hit the exact same target. In this case, they could both hit each other's hands. And that's where Andrzej's tactics of leaving the exchange after a counterattack really saves him here, because despite the fact that he got a very, very nice arm shot on that left side, his opponent sort of guesses wrong and goes a little bit too low with his counterattack. And what that means is that Andrzej's tactics sort of worked out for him here because it allowed him to leave the exchange without getting hit back. So, looking at this next exchange, what we see is another variation on the exact same opener. What we see is Andrzej throw his lead stab again, only this time his opponent is backing all the way out of the exchange. So in response, Andrzej throws a slightly deeper lunge, but has a planned attack for dealing with his opponent as he leaves. He throws the exact same lead thrust. He sees that his opponent is kind of doing a deflecting cut off to his left side. So instead of doing the hang and parry, which would be very difficult to do because if you don't know, whenever a deflecting parry happens, basically the opponent will have the inside line, and it makes it very difficult for you to dip your tip because the sword is in the way. It'll basically prevent you from getting your sword onto any side other than the one that it was just pushed onto. So you see a bit of a adaptation here from Andrzej's opponent. But what Andrzej does is go up into a cron parry, which is sort of a neutral version where you can sort of push your arms onto either side, left or right. And even if you guess wrong, as Andrzej sort of does in this case, where his opponent kind of throws a left Zverkow, but Andrzej pushes his hands over to the wrong side, it's still enough to push his opponent's blade up into the air and get that deflection so that he stays safe. And from there, Andrzej does a very smart thing, which is, again, to throw his hanging parry, eat that counterattack up high, and throw another counterattack low as he exits the exchange. And what this really shows is that Andrzej's style is one where he has a lot of different options and a lot of different tools that can get him into the position that he wants to be in, which in this case, I would say is almost always a high, hard bind, either in a hang and parry or a cron parry. And that puts him into his pre-programmed mode where he will then leave the exchange, throw a cut onto the left side, usually hitting either the head or the arms or the body, depending on where the distance happens to be at the time. And then he will exit the exchange and be perfectly safe. So the last thing I want to go over is what Andrzej does when his opponent adapts to his style. So if you go back and you look at the video I did before, one thing that you might remember is that one way to deal with people who are always aggressive in the initial action is to go backwards and pick apart their legs or their extremities, which is exactly what happens here. So what does someone like Andrzej do in response to this adaptation? And it's a bit of a difficult thing to do because, again, Andrzej's style depends so heavily on that initial thrusting action. But there's really two things to do. The first is what we saw Andrzej do there, which is basically to up the aggression and come forward with a thrust that, frankly, wasn't really going to land given how far outside range it was. But what it does is it prompts his opponent to give him the hard bind that he's looking for. And as long as he puts enough momentum forward, what he does is he prevents his opponent from meaningfully hitting him in the legs or any extremities while moving forward because, one, he's scared by the thrust that he sees coming, even though it's a little bit outside range, and more importantly, he can't really run backwards fast enough. But what you see a little bit more often than that is what happens here. So Andrzej, again, is having his legs sniped, but he did something very smart beforehand, and that was to shore up his stance and be defensive. So one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that when you're going for an extremity shot, like you see Andrzej's opponent doing here, where he's aiming for Andrzej's legs, is that if you are the aggressor during this extremity shot, what you have to do is often engage a lot deeper than you think you have to. So by shoring up his stance and staying on the defensive, Andrzej baited his opponent into overextending himself when going for that leg shot, ensuring that pretty much no matter how deep or how shallow he had tried to go, his head was going to be open the entire time. So as you see there, you get that good double out of it, where now Andrzej knows that any time his opponent is going to go for his legs, he should throw an attack down low up at his opponent's head. It'll probably be there to be hit. And more importantly, if you see an extremity shot like this one, where his opponent sort of goes for his hands, the exact same principle can apply. As long as you sit there and you wait for that attack to come out, you can still throw your defensive actions, the exact same ones that Andrzej has been showing to be done in any other thing. And if they overextend themselves in order to reach it, what you'll find is that there's always something to be done afterwards, and Andrzej can go right back into the exact same plays that he has been used to up till now. So if you'd like to fight like Andrzej, go back and watch some of this footage, and maybe you can incorporate some of his techniques into your own sparring. And of course, if you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send an email over at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.